Welcome to PWS Connect, a podcast for the Prader-Willi syndrome community, brought to you by PWSA USA. This podcast gives the latest news in research, advocacy, and family support by bringing together staff, volunteers, PWS treatment specialists, biotech and pharmaceutical representatives, caregivers, family members, and individuals with PWS. Our goal is to connect education, awareness, and resources with those living with PWS and their supporters. Join us in our mission to enhance the quality of life and empower those affected by Prader-Willi syndrome. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of PWS Connect. My name is Annie Fricke, and I am the Marketing and Communications Coordinator at PWSA USA. My guests today are both parents of children with PWS and advocates within the PWS community and beyond. Deanie Rao and Janelle Conway spoke with me about a newly formed group in the PWS community, the BIPOC Affinity Group. Deanie is an Undoing Racism community organizer, special needs advocate, and wine entrepreneur. Deanie has been hosting wine tastings for over 25 years. In the past 5 years, she has also served on various DEI committees and boards. As a parent to 2 kids, one with Prader-Willi syndrome, Deanie spends much of her time caregiving and advocating. She aims to use her hosting and organizing skills, along with her Harvard MBA, to create more justice and joy in the world. Janelle has dedicated her life to serving and educating others. She is a graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point with a BS in System Engineering and Latin American Studies. She also holds a Master's in Business and Organizational Security Management from Webster University. She has been credentialed as a Department of Defense sexual assault victim advocate, and she pursued training and certification as a court-appointed special advocate, otherwise known as CASA, for children entering the foster care system within Bell County, Texas. These roles have strengthened her resolve to advocate for the voiceless and for those whose voice is too often disregarded or discounted. She comes to us as a Black parent who understands some of the struggles that come with caring for someone diagnosed with a rare disease. Her eldest daughter is 4 and was diagnosed with PWS at 20 weeks in utero. I have a few notes before we get started. I was asked to clarify that any person of color or person raising people of color in the PWS community are welcome to join the Affinity group without having to be involved in organizing. There are some people in the group working on advocacy and growing the group, but if you are a person of color or raising a person of color in the PWS community, then you are welcome to join simply for the community, the learning, and the struggling to do better. During this interview, we make reference to some resources like other podcasts, books, and articles, and the links to those resources can be found in the show notes. I strongly encourage you, listener, to check out those resources, especially if this topic is new to you or not something you're familiar with, you want to learn more, or if you're not a person of color. If we are to be a successfully inclusive community, it is important to learn about the obstacles and challenges uniquely faced by others in this community and understand how we can help remove those obstacles. And if you're so inspired, grab a pen and paper and take notes when we talk about allyship. Now, let's get into it. Thank you so much for being here. I'm with Janelle Conway and Deanie Rao, and we are going to be talking about the BIPOC Affinity Group for the PWS community. And so if we can just start with, Deanie, let's start with you. If you'd like to just introduce yourself, your connection to the PWS community, and just tell us a little about yourself, what you're comfortable sharing.
Sure, yeah. I am Deanie Rao. I am a descendant of people from India, the region where we speak Tamil, so I consider myself Tamil. And I am mother to 2 daughters. The younger one is Ione. She's 8 years old, and she's the one living with Prader-Willi syndrome. We live in the DC area.
Thank you. And Janelle?
I like to say that I'm a military family. We're also in the DMV area with Dini. My husband and I were both military. My husband's retired. I'm still in the military, Army. And our daughter, Angelica, is 4, and she has PWS. And we're a Black family. I've got some Asian, some Korean in me as well. My grandmother's Asian, Korean, and our connection really is, Angelica has brought us to this community. That's Prater Willie, and I'm excited to be on this podcast.
Nice. Well, I'm grateful that you're both here. So if we could start by talking about the BIPOC Affinity group, how it got started. I know it's new. So yeah, just talk about kind of how it got started and the inspiration behind it.
For me, this Janelle, but for me, our daughter, we've known she's had PWS since before she was born. So over 4 years now, we've been kind of connected to this community. And being a Black family, we were constantly on the lookout for other families of color. When you're a parent, you're constantly, they say don't compare your children, but you're constantly like, okay, who's got the similar circumstances? So who may be a little bit older or who may be a bit close to the age, so you can kind of see the projection or hope to kind of get a glimpse of what your child's future might be. When we got our daughter's diagnosis while she was still in utero at 20 weeks, we were on the lookout to see people of color. But everyone who was being introduced to us were white, and we were just kind of curious as to where does this condition not affect folks of color? And so we would go to the online conferences and not see anyone. We were in the Facebook groups, and there were a couple, but they had like several other conditions, and we were just really on the look just to kind of see, what's next. What are we doing? What can we do? And at the PWSA conference, USA conference that we went to last year, we intentionally got our money together and says, you know what, let's go to the conference. We're going to hopefully see some others just to kind of connect in person with folks that we had met online. It was good. We were looking to see people of color, and we saw people of color. We had met Dini. We had seen her before at a race for FPWR, Foundation for Prater Willie Research, at a walk. But we had saw her at the conference, and I think that's when we really connected, because we were like, man, where are all the other people of color? Because we wanted to have a conversation like, hey, are they doing this? Hey, when did you get your diagnosis? Kind of thing. Just to kind of see, what are things that we're not doing? Hey, are they telling you? It's all kinds of questions that you typically have, or you could have, to just kind of get a better feel if you're doing the right things for your child. So I had always been on the search. So that's, for me, internally, it was like, I need to see other people of color, just so I have a sense of, a breadth of what's possible, what's not possible, what if there are any limitations, if they're not. I just wanted to see it. And so it was really starting out, let's just find some folks. And then really at the PWSA conference, Dee and I had saw each other again. You're like, we need to at least start a chat, because then we had met other mothers. And they were like, oh man, you all are the first folks I've met. So at the conference, we kind of met, I know I at least met 3 or 4 other people of color, moms of color, parents of color. And my husband, Charles, he kind of was in charge of the dad's group for fathers of folks with PWS. And we said, let's just start a chat, at least the women. And so we started a WhatsApp chat. And then from there, I kind of just let it be. And I was content with that, because I was able to kind of make some connections. But Dini being very more organized and being in this space a lot more, had some bigger ideas. And when she offered, and I'll let her talk about it, she offered up kind of a bigger concept. I was like on board, because it meant we got to reach out to more people of color.
That's perfect to know. I mean, I think you just speak to exactly what I see in so many other places. So, Annie, I've been doing community organizing with the tools of the Undoing Racism workshop that come from an organization called PSAB, People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And I've been doing that for the last 5 years, and also serving on some equity and inclusion committees. And what I was seeing in all these other realms, whether it was education or different communities, is that if you don't pay attention to the specific needs of people of color, whether it's education or health, the outcomes are always poorer for the people of color, right? And this is just something we know. This is data. It's a fact. And so I came into this community and I started asking questions. I would ask questions at the conferences, I would ask questions of leadership, and I would be like, okay, what's being done? I remember one panel at the PWSA conference in Orlando where I asked a panelist of pharmaceutical companies who are organizing clinical trials, and they were talking about that process. And I asked them, what are you all doing to diversify clinical trials? And they were really surprised by the question, I would say, and they were unprepared. And, it was pretty clear to me that not enough was happening. And it was also clear to me that they wanted that. Like, it wasn't like it was just us speaking up and saying, like, we want this to happen. It was like, no, this is a problem we have. We need to diversify trials. It's not just better for people of color, it's better for everybody. And we actually want to do those things. We just don't know how. And I thought, okay, well, I've done this a couple places before. I've got some tools that we can start out with. But what I really need in doing that is I need other folks to come together, because I'm a big believer you can't do this by yourself. And I especially wanted to partner with some Black families, because I think that one of the reasons we chose the name BIPOC Affinity Group for our group is that, the acronym stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, BIPOC. And there's a reason why the B and the I come first. The Black and the Indigenous folks are the ones who have historically been marginalized the most. So we see that time and time again. There's historic oppression, particularly of Black and Indigenous people. So I knew I wanted to partner with some Black folks to be able to represent what their needs are. And so we formed this little organizer group, and there's this other woman, Corrine, from Toronto. So I was really fortunate that we said, okay, at least some of us will take on the realm and be organizers, and there'll be other folks who will be part of the affinity group who will be able to listen from and provide kind of the support and community that Janelle was talking about. But at least a few of us could take on the responsibility of organizing. So the other great thing that came out is I asked similar questions at the FPWR conference, and Susan Hedstrom, who is the leader there, the executive director, she came to me and she said, okay, Deanie, you're asking these questions, and I don't know what we should do. What can we do? And her turning to me and asking me that really encouraged me to say, like, okay, I do have these experiences. I can bring this to this group. And so now she and Stacy Ward, CEO of PWSA, have been wonderful partners for us in this. So I'll say there's a group of us that are people of color. And also, I can't speak enough to the importance that people in power, people with privilege and who are in leadership, are also taking this on.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear that there's movement.
I think, when did we send out our flyer? I think it was in May. So we really, maybe late May. June 1st, I think it officially went out. And so it's been less than 60 days. We've been an official group for the public to be aware of. So
can we talk a little bit about, just kind of get into some of the issues, your personal experiences, if you have any, or experiences of people that you're close with where this has been an issue. Like, what, I think some people, not everybody knows why we need to have these conversations, why we need to really dive into this. I was listening to this podcast in preparation for this. It was actually out of the UK. They were interviewing a woman, Layal Liverpool, and she wrote a book called Systemic: How Racism is Making Us Ill. And in this podcast, in this conversation, there's this premise in medicine that race can be a risk factor for certain problems. And what she wanted to shift it to was that it's actually, you should change the word race with racism, and how racism is a risk factor for certain issues. So I thought that was really poignant. And I think it's something that isn't necessarily talked about enough, at least not by, people like me, white people in America. So I think it's important to maybe kind of go into some of those issues. And Deanie, like you said in the email, like there's, experts who talk about this. But if you have your own personal experiences, just to kind of give a glimpse of maybe what some of the obstacles are, or some of the issues that really need to be looked at.
Well, Deanie, I'll go first if you don't mind. So for me, Annie, I think I'm fortunate as a Black woman of color. Typically, my personal experience has been to be fearful of the medical, just because my voice is now often heard when it comes to what I want to do with my care. When I was pregnant with Angelica, I had a lot of people making decisions about taking it to term, delivering early, cesarean, all these things that I was kind of discounted. And I remember, and again, I'm in the military and I have great health care, great insurance, I'm educated, and I have all these things going for me that gives me power to voice. But I remember delivering my daughter, and she had PWS, and just going through that process. And I remember talking to the doctor, like female, she was literally like treating me like I was mooching off the military system. Like, hey, you guys have to get out this bed. You've been here for 3 or 4 days, even though my daughter was sitting in the NICU. And I remember we were trying to tell her, like, listen, we're just waiting for, at the time it was the Fisher House, which is a home, kind of a transit place for military people to stay while they're waiting for their children to kind of get out the NICU. But she was so adamant, and I was like, well, can you understand that, we're waiting for this next process? Do I need to leave out this bed, out this room by 5 o'clock today, or can we stay in the morning? And her bedside manner, her just reaction to me was just so like, I don't know, we ended up making a complaint later. I remember feeling like she thought I was trying to mooch off the system. Like I was trying to take advantage of my military benefits and stay in this. It was a very nice suite, because I'm a soldier, but she felt like I was taking up space, and it was time for me to move on. And I remember making that complaint to her supervisor and talking to the nurses, who had said, yeah, she has an issue with that. So that was my experience. That's been really the only experience that I kind of can come to the front of my mind that was kind of overt. But in my head, I felt like I've had good treatment. I'm very vocal because of my education, because of my knowledge, because of my status of where I work, because I have the funds. That experience talking to other people isn't the case. I've met many people of color, Black people, Black women, moms, who tell me that they didn't get their diagnosis till later. And you'll hear a little bit more about that. Or, they knew something was wrong, and, the doctor just said, well, it's your diet. So it was things like that. Like, people, we know when something's off with our children. For me, having had that experience after my daughter was born and having to fight to kind of like advocate for myself, and I had all these resources at my disposal, and still having to fight against that. And it may not have been race, it could have been economic, I don't know. But I feel very strongly that had I been a white person, I may not have gotten as much resistance. I may have gotten a little bit more empathy. And so now that I'm in a position where, I do feel vocal, I feel like I need to kind of talk for those who don't feel empowered. So that's kind of been my experience. It's almost the antithesis, like me. I've had that one experience that comes to my mind. I'm sure there's been others that I'm not aware of, that I've been oblivious to, but that what comes to my mind. I just think about the other moms, the parents who are being seen as moochers off the system because they're asking for treatment or they're asking for extra care. And I want to be able to equip them with the knowledge, like, no, this is appropriate for you to ask. No, this is appropriate for you to request these services. You're not mooching off the system. You're not taking advantage. These are the things that you should advocate for your child and be empowered to do that. It's not overt, is what I can say. And it's hard for me to put a finger on it because I'm in a position where it hasn't happened as much. I feel like if I wasn't, it would happen more. And that's kind of why I've really wanted to be part of the BIPOC Affinity group.
And Janelle, when you talk about these experiences, I believe you. And I believe you especially because I know that the data backs up what you're saying. The truth is that each of us individually, when we face that, when a doctor doesn't believe us, when a teacher thinks that, oh, my child's ill-behaved because they have assumptions about how my race and my people should behave, we always think, oh, am I the only one, And I think that's ultimately one of the biggest reasons to come together, is to see where our experiences overlap. For me, as you know, Janelle and Annie, my daughter Ione wasn't diagnosed until she was 5 years old. And it wasn't because she had all the telltale symptoms. She had so much struggling to feed and to swallow and to suck. She had incredibly low tone, that floppy baby experience. We had those things since birth. We had wonderful access, I'll put it that way, to resources. I have a high level of education. I have a high degree of privilege of resources. And despite that, we weren't able to get a diagnosis for so long. And I think there are a couple of things at play. One is that there is a visual image that a lot of people in the medical community have about what a Prader-Willi kid looks like. And that's fed by the literature that shows, they think blonde hair, blue eyes, they think fairer skin than the rest of the family. And while those things may be true in white children, they're not true in babies of color. So they don't even have the kind of mental image to be able to pull from. And we all know that the process of diagnosis has as much art to it as, unfortunately, as science. And so you're relying on a lot of things that in people's implicit bias. What do they believe? Not their conscious. Most people I've met are not consciously racist, right? They don't consciously want to put you down because you're a person of color. But the problem is we're all swimming in this ocean where our culture and all of our education and all of our training since the moment we're put on this earth tells us that white people are superior. And I know that can be a confrontational statement. I don't mean it to be that, because I know many people don't believe that, but that's just what our culture is telling us. And there are a lot of images and literature that reinforce that. So when Ione and I would tell the doctor, this isn't right. She needs more testing. And they would say, don't worry about it. Like, everything's fine. She's really pretty mild. And there's a good chance you'll never have a diagnosis. I see that a lot. And then through some of my anti-racism work, I started to learn that a lot of implicit bias of medical professionals, and this is again backed by data, shows that they're willing to accept a higher pain tolerance for people of color. They're willing to accept poorer outcomes and say oh, we just have no diagnosis. Whereas if it is a white child, they will have some personal belief system that tells them this is not acceptable. We have to find a cure. There's got to be something we can do. And they'll try just that little bit harder.
It's almost like they see their child easier.
Yeah, exactly. They might see their child. And unfortunately, even some of the experiences we had of this were with doctors of color. So it's not only white folks that have these biases that we need to uncover. The other problem we hear from the community at large, and Janelle spoke to this a bit, is that we just don't know if the treatments that are being offered will work for our kids. So there hasn't been enough research done yet on, whether the interventions are behavioral interventions, whether they're pharmaceutical interventions, whatever they are. There's not enough data because there aren't enough people of color yet participating in the spaces. So I think just naturally, you're going to have less access to medical knowledge and services. And all of this is before we talk about all of the problems that you have with people with less access to resources and less access to education. I mean, this is where the race becomes even clearer, because we all know that people of color also, in addition to these problems, have access to less resources. So whenever we're in these groups and communities and stuff like that, and I just want to remind other parents, think about how hard it is to be a parent of someone living with Prader-Willi. Think about how hard it is to have your child have a disability. And then add on to that all of this systemic racism and sometimes personal prejudice that we face. And I just think that more needs to be done.
Yeah, there's so many, there's so much to cover with this topic. And I had a hard time kind of organizing the questions, and I'm already wanting to jump around. But what you just said was something that I was thinking about. Hopefully this brings value to the conversation, but kind of this, I'm a part of the DEI committee at my daughter's school for the last few years. So I've learned about the term intersectionality. That's not something that I thought about, when I had Freya, and then now we were part of this disability community. And in some way I was like, oh, well, I assumed it was kind of an even playing field, I guess, in the realm of disability. I never thought about, then racism coming into disability until I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. I did an interview with a woman, a teacher in Philadelphia, and she talked about racism and special education. It was just very eye-opening for me, that conversation, and just realizing, oh yeah, the same issues that affect people in normal, quote unquote, society or whatever, they're there in the disability community as well. And so yeah, how that just compounds all of those issues. Deanie, you brought up personal prejudice versus systemic racism, which I don't know if you wanted to go into that a little bit, kind of, or if that's just too big for this.
It is big, and I'll always preface it by saying that I am not an expert in this, right? There are people who have PhDs in this, and I think they could explain it much better. But I do think it's an important concept to be able, so that people don't feel defensive when they hear all this, right? There's a lot,
Mhm.
I think, that goes on for all of us, all of our baggage that comes in. And I know, especially for some white folks, it can be like, I'm listening to this and I feel bad. I feel like I am not racist. I don't have any hatred for these people of color. And why am I being lumped in with everybody? And why would anybody think that well-meaning doctors could have any racism? And the thing is that the structures in this country, the structures in many parts of the Western world, were all actually built to be able to keep certain people on top. When this country was founded, and slavery was still a problem. We were taking land from people and committing genocide on indigenous people. So really, when everything was created, whether it was the education system or the health systems and things like that, it was to perpetuate that, to keep certain people on top. And the little shreds of that, of the seeds that were planted many, many years ago, they're still there. And unless we intentionally, and that's why I love this workshop that I take part in, it's called Undoing Racism. And the belief is that racism, that was something that was done, it was created, and it can therefore also be undone, but not if we ignore it, not if we pretend it's not there. It has to be deliberately taken apart. And that means that the structures usually are the ones, more so than the people, although the people are part of the structures, but the structures are the ones that we need to say, okay, do we need newborn screenings? Do we need to show different faces? Do we need, what are all the things that we can do, rather than so-and-so's bad, or why haven't we done this? Let's focus on what can be done.
Especially when it comes to building trust so that people of color can feel part of the community, included, and that comes to being intentional about ensuring they're considered. And I like what you say, Deanie. Sometimes it's like, or what I've heard oftentimes is, yeah, you don't see color, then that means you don't see us, and you don't see the absence of us. And it's important, especially when we're talking about diversity. And I know it can be such a charged word these days, but it's important because we need all scopes and everyone benefits from the inclusion of everyone. We get so much information, and appreciate you saying that, Deanie.
This podcast that you suggested for me, this series, it brought up things that I don't know that I've thought about, and I found myself questioning, like, oh, well, did I think that there were biological differences to race? Like, I don't know. I think I did. But it wasn't something that I ever really had to think about too hard. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I mean, I learned a lot, and we don't know what we don't know, but also, like, we're not always aware of what our thoughts are if we're not doing this unpacking, if we're not doing this undoing of these long held parts of our education that we've had.
Say one other thing, Annie, because I just want to give you, props for that, because I think that's all it takes is some openness to be able to look at what we're doing, to make some changes, to be a little vulnerable, right? And it takes that openness both on the white folk side and the people of color, because we also have our own baggage. I know especially with Asian Americans, we're sometimes taught to be the model minority. It's all about being a good kid, following the rules, not ruffling any feathers. Right. So we purposefully won't instigate or bring things up in front of white folks because we're afraid of the ramifications of it. We're afraid that maybe historically there was violence, or even now it might just be more shunning, or I won't be your friend anymore. So I think what Janelle said about building trust in these spaces, we want our PWS community to be a place where people of color can show up and they can feel safe. And again, there's historical reasons why they don't feel safe in medical establishments. Talk about Indigenous and Black folks. There have been forced sterilizations. They've been tricked into going to trials and told that they were getting some medicine for their benefit. And in fact, it was very harmful to them. So there is a history and a baggage that everybody brings to this that we have to be willing to unpack.
Yeah. And that's historically across, that we know about. And then individuals, just because they're people of color, Black, their personal experience and their trust, with their own medical professionals that we may not be knowing about. And so it's going to be so important in this space, this Prader-Willi community, that, and we'll talk about it later, we'll talk about allies, but we make people feel like their voice is important and their experience is valid. When they bring up, if I bring up, this happened to me during my diagnosis story, and no one makes excuses for it. You know what I'm saying? just like we wouldn't want anyone to make excuses for our child, whether we're white or Black, about why that we didn't get the diagnosis. So I think that's going to be extremely important, especially as we starting to build and invite and be, more open with those communications.
So you're forming this group and you are looking for representation for a bigger community. You're looking to find other families that you can connect with.
No, you're right. Yes. It's exactly it. We want to be a kind of a hub.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there are people of color, families of color that are kind of like, oh, I see you. Your child has, they're doing that. And it may be onesie or twosies. For many people, that does not happen.
Mm-hmm.
They don't even see it. And so between, the hubs for family outreach, FPWR, PWSA, organizations, who knows what's out there, where disease community might even have it, to kind of, I don't say follow them, but just kind of direct them that here is an option. If you're looking for that community, that we could be a very good option with regards to just sharing and giving them that space to understand and hear them as well, and make sure, their concerns are heard.
As far as getting more families of color to conferences and to getting them to places, what are some things that the organizations can do? Like, what are some things that PWSA could do?
One wonderful step that both organizations are doing now for the upcoming conferences, both for the FPWR and then the United and Hope conference coming next year, is they've offered scholarships. So obviously access to resources is always one obstacle. The other obstacle is getting the word out to the people of color, right? Again, there's been some history here of them not participating in these spaces. So we've got to overcome these hurdles of like, what's going to make them feel good. And we're hoping our group can do a little of that, of like knowing that, okay, we're going to be there. We're going to make sure that the panelists and the topics and everything reflect you as well, make sure it's relevant.
So there's big things that leaders can do, positions, boards can do, and then there's things that individuals can do to kind of help. And I understand Deanie is, it is a lot that can be done, but to kind of make it bite-sized, definitely the big things are happening by us, participating with Stacy and Susan from FPWR and PWSA USA. Those are some big things. Their staff is going to provide those big things by making sure that they see and just consider the question, do we have enough representation? So systemically, we can help with that. Individuals, families, I think they can ask that question too. Instead of like, oh, why is this important? But can understand that diversity brings a better conclusion, outcome, and kind of embrace that. And understand that we are not trying to put anyone on the defensive when it comes to talking about race, just to kind of understand it and receive that, and then seek out maybe perhaps. And if hey, what was your experience? And just hear, like I said earlier, hear their story for what it is without making excuses, just hear their story for what it is and understand that, yeah, some people have had a bad experience like many of us, but their experience is theirs and it may be attributed to prejudices due to race or racism rather, and accept that without feeling the need to excuse it because it's not a reflection of them. And I think that's kind of the big thing. And then invite their friends, here's a person of color. Oh, you know what? Have you heard about the BIPOC group? I think that would be very helpful because it's not just our responsibility as people of color to invite people to the BIPOC. It can be everyone's to know that, hey, your experience is different from mine. Here's a group that, their experience may be different from yours because everybody's different, but they may have similar, just recognizing that without feeling offended, that there is a group that exists. And I think that's important. And that's how the community can help. And I pray, hopefully this podcast will allow them to receive that, that we have different experiences. And because of the systemic racism, particularly on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we have a different experience historically when it comes to medical community, medical interactions with medical professionals and how that may impact our ability to participate in things that could be beneficial for all, like the global registry, There's not a lot of people who register because of that concern and fear. What are they going to do with this information? And we want to, before we just ask for the BIPOC community to just wholeheartedly register, we need to let them know that, there's trust that's there. And that comes with conversation. That comes with talking, interaction with the community itself. Mm-hmm.
The truth is that it takes a lot for a person of color to show up in these spaces, right? You don't know. A, it may be very difficult for you to get away from your family and to afford to be able to show up. And then B, this is a place where you're surrounded by people you don't know what you'll face. I participated in the PWSA fly-in where I met you, Annie, and it was a fabulous experience. And there was one experience that I had where we were trying to get into a tour in the Capitol, and I was with another mom, a white woman, and the security guard out there singled me out. And it was really, really rude to me. And there were kind of 3 incidents then where she just purposely kind of singled me out and took the opportunity to kind of verbally beat me up. And it's like, okay, I'm putting myself in this situation, and that's what sometimes we'll face. And so if you know that that's what it takes, the level of bravery it takes really for folks of color to show up anyways, knowing that they can face these types of experiences, and sometimes, unfortunately, even from members of our community, then what I do and what one of my daughter's kindergarten teachers taught me very on, she's like, when you see other people of color, when you see Black folks, walk up and say hi. Say, hey, I'm glad you're here. Like, you can do very small things to make them feel welcome, make them know that they're seen, and make them feel like they belong. We can all do that.
Well, I'm sorry that happened to you in DC. Thinking of that instant, is there something that the woman you were with, is there a way she could have supported you? Or, I mean, maybe she did, or was like, I don't know, maybe we can use that as an example for people on how to handle situations like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is such a tricky thing because it depends on the resources that person has. And I'd say the first step is awareness, because I don't think that woman recognized it for what it was. She was only around for one of the kind of interactions and not the others. And it just, I think this happens with a lot of my white friends, is that it never occurs to you that you're being singled out because of the color of your skin, right? Because you haven't had to ever consider the color of your skin in your interactions with people for the most part. So it's like having this broadened awareness, kind of empathy really, to say like, oh, is this dynamic happening because that is a white security guard and this, my friend here, is a person of color? And then, getting educated in all of these things so that you know what you can say in those moments of saying, like, she's my friend, she's with me. Especially what I would love to hear white listeners of this podcast do is when there are going to be folks out there who are going to say, why do we need this BIPOC affinity group? Isn't that reverse racism? Why are we putting resources into this, right? There's going to be so many, unfortunately, just by the fact that we create something that isn't taking away from anybody else, people are going to have issues with it. So what I would love is for folks to go into the notes of this show and to listen to some of those resources. They're wonderful resources, and I'm not going to be able to do them justice. The Seeing White podcasts and books we'll recommend and things like that. How to Talk About Race, that's a fabulous book. And get comfortable. Start having those conversations. When you hear people in these places talk about it, say, well, here's why we need it. That's one of because we're not always in those rooms, and we're certainly not in those conversations, right? So look around the room and say, like, who's not represented here? Who needs to be in the room, and how can I be a voice for them because I'm in the room?
Yeah, one of the things that you suggested in the email was, when there's panelists or they're talking about clinical trials, saying, what are you doing to kind of diversify this trial? How is this going to affect this certain community or that community? And just really kind of pushing past that assumption that what works for white culture is going to work, or, that's the standard that we need to use. So just kind of really pushing those boundaries and forcing these researchers to kind of look past that. Sorry, Janelle, I thought you were going to say something.
Oh, no. I was just thinking about the law that's out there, and I'm not educated enough to talk about the DEPICT Act, but I know that that's a step. Drug companies now have to include, a certain level of diversity in their trials because of the concern about when you do the testing on predominantly white patients, the side effects as it relates to the BIPOC community. It's unknown, or it may not be any, but it's not known. We got to be included. It's all good data, and it's all helpful for everybody.
And there are, I don't know the specifics, but I was reading about how one of the reasons why the DEPICT Act is so important, again, not just to people of color, but for all folks, is that when you diversify these clinical trials, everybody's outcome is better. right? Like they're
Mhm.
good examples of how the white folks also benefit from the people of color being included because there's just more to learn. So I think it really is an issue of like, don't just wait for the people of color to ask that question and to demand it of these trials. Like we should all want that outcome.
Now we've got this big advocacy element to PWSA. And so I'm wondering, and maybe since you guys are just forming, you haven't gotten to this part of the discussion yet, but I'm interested
we
to
are.
know, like, if there are talking points you'd like to see taken to DC or to state local governments.
We've talked about, how important the BIPOC Affinity Group is to ensure that, we're seen, we're heard, that we're included in a conversation. A good advocacy point is that we're considered when it comes to access to drugs, access to health, access to the things that we need to do when it comes to genetic testing. That's kind of a big talking point. My daughter, thankfully, she has our primary insurance and she also has Medicaid. And so we get a lot of those things. And we're in the state of Virginia. And some states it's not that easy for whatever the reason may be. But Medicaid is a huge provider for people in the BIPOC community who needs these very important drugs like growth hormone, and being able to ensure that that population is considered when you talk about what drugs can be paid for by Medicaid, what drugs are maybe considered. I don't even know if this is a word, optional or maybe not, medically necessary, just kind of those decisions. I think that's kind of the big point.
And making sure the PWS tests can go on newborn screenings. We want to be able to take out the art from this diagnosis piece. We just want every possible person to get diagnosed as soon as possible so they can get the right treatment.
That's right. And, and in the back of my head, almost every Black, Indigenous person of color that I've met that has a loved one that's diagnosed with Prader-Willi has received that diagnosis. And I've met at least maybe 10 or 15 after, 2 years of age, and I don't have the data. But that is something that, because we need more people of color to kind of participate and provide us their story, that was kind of concerning to me. I'm very thankful that we were able to get ours as part of prenatal testing. It's just kind of reiterate what Deanie said about making sure we get the right genetic testing early, as early as possible. Who's to say we have to wait till they're born?
Yeah, good point.
Is there anything that you wanted to make sure we touched on before you let people know how to get in touch with you?
I think it is important that we kind of communicate what our long-term vision for this group is, which is that we see a world where people of all shades who are living with and are affected by Prader-Willi syndrome are living their best lives. And that's going to be a direct result of improved health outcomes. And we see that's possible. We want to take out skin color as a factor in how people can be treated. And so, we have some initial steps, like some short-term goals that we're working on towards this. And they're basically like, how can we communicate about this group and build partnerships? So thank you for helping us with that goal, Annie. This definitely goes a long way towards that. We want to expand our group to include more people of color. We know there are a lot of folks out there yet who don't know we exist and would be interested in joining. And then once we gather those folks, we want to listen and learn, really understand like what does our community need. And then I think we'll be able to go forward from there.
And as part of that, we have we are starting out, but we have an email. That email will just let us know about your interests, and you'll get a little survey that kind of just helps us understand if the group is the best fit. But we communicate through Signal, and then we have an email dish will just kind of share information that we think isn't really getting out to the BIPOC community for whatever reason, either because they're not connected with PWS USA or FPWR for whatever reason, that we're hoping to kind of make sure we're able to use that communication chain to help get out to those folks who may not be connected directly to those organizations.
So the first step would be to email the BIPOC email?
That's right. That's BIPOC, BIPOC, PWS @gmail.com.
Well, I just want to say thank you both so much for being here and talking with me today.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for the thoughtful questions and research and really just openness. I want to stress, I think if everyone could come onto this with openness, we can really get far. And also thank you so much to Janelle and Charles for their partnership. It's been huge having them a part of this.
I'm looking forward to how much interaction we're going to get in the community.
Thank you for listening to this episode of PWS Connect. remember to like and follow our podcast. If you want to learn more about Prader-Willi syndrome and how PWSA USA is making strides in advocacy and supporting our community, please visit www.pwsausa.org. Our team is always available to support families and their loved ones living with PWS, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You can call us at 941-312-0400 or email info@pwsausa.org. Catch a new episode next Tuesday, and until then, have a great week.